hostage in Glasgow's jail. The inspector accused of shooting a mother of 6. The president in his bathrobe is chomping at the bit. On the beach, sun, sea, sand and pollution. And together again, Flo gets her ebb back. Good evening. 3 prison officers are being held hostage tonight by inmates at Bulletin prison in Glasgow. But other warders who'd been trapped with them when the trouble started have managed to escape. 34 prison officers got minor injuries earlier when they tried to rescue their trapped colleagues. The prisoners say their hostages are in good condition and won't be harmed. Bulletin prison was built over 100 years ago. It holds 1,259 men, although it was designed for 900. All categories of prisoners are housed there. The trouble started on the top floor of B Hall last night, when about 20 of the 188 prisoners attacked warders because, they said, of the warders' brutality.
There has been a number of incidents since the 30th of December, during which a number of my members have been injured and had to be treated in hospital for wounds caused by throwing batteries and other missiles, hitting a prison officer over the head with a chair, these sort of incidents over the past few days, prior to the one last night.
So there were early warning signs that it could blow up?
There was obviously an indication that there was something building up, yes.
The prison officer's spokesman. Now we have the latest from Glasgow.
A young prison warder dragged at knife point onto the roof of Bulletin prison. His hair held by masked prisoners, the officer exhausted and clearly afraid for his life. "Please, they're going to kill me," he shouted down to newsmen. This was the moment the authorities and the outside world learned the true scale of the riot. 28-year-old David Flanagan, one of 3 warders taken hostage. The prisoners who took over B Block last night have spent the day showing off riot shields and truncheons captured in fighting with police and prison staff. Many of the inmates wearing uniforms of prison warders. Makeshift banners say the takeover was a protest at alleged ill-treatment of an inmate called Sammy Ralston. 14 prison officers spent the day barricaded in top-floor cells where they'd locked themselves in for their own safety. Attempts to evacuate them brought a violent reaction from the men on the roof, ripping up slates to use as missiles. A skirmish involving many more men inside the jail, clearly audible. One prisoner produced a riot shield, apparently stained with blood. Bulletin prison has a recent history of ill-feeling between inmates and prison staff. The Prison Officers Association say the governor had been warned to expect trouble. This is the man at the centre of the riot, Sammy Ralston, who staged his own protest last year. His fellow inmates say he's been savagely beaten by warders. His mother's been refused permission to see him.
Well, apparently these chaps that are on the roof shouting down to me that he'd been beaten up. So not only as women he has been, you know.
And is there any, again, indication as to who did beat him up?
Well, they're shouting down it's the warders that beat him up with sticks.
It's now more than 5 hours since any of the hostages have been seen. There are no outward signs of negotiations taking place, apart from the repeated shouts from the rooftops. And even those have now stopped as temperatures drop below freezing point. Paul Davis, News at 10, Bulletin Prison, Glasgow.
Mrs. Cherry Gross, whose shooting in a police raid set off the Brixton riots 2 years ago, told the Old Bailey today about the gun she saw pointing at her heart. She said she tried to escape, but there was a bang and her legs gave way. Inspector Douglas Lovelock denies unlawfully and maliciously wounding her. The superintendent said police hadn't been able to keep Mrs. Gross's house under observation and hadn't asked Lambeth Council for the plans because details of police operations had been leaked before. Lambeth Council said tonight that claim should be substantiated, but they didn't disclose confidential information about tenants unless there were extremely good reasons.
15 months after being hit by a policeman's bullet, Cherry Gross came to the Old Bailey today to relive her ordeal. She's been paralysed ever since and confined to a wheelchair, and it was from that chair she told the jury her story. She was awake early on the morning of September the 28th, 1985, and heard a noise outside her bedroom. I rushed for the door, she said, and was pushed back by people coming in. They were in uniform. I saw a person in front of me holding a gun. He was crouching, holding the weapon with both hands. He was only a yard away, and the gun was pointing at my heart. I tried to get away. I heard a bang. I realized I was hit, and my legs gave way. The man accused of wounding her, Inspector Douglas Lovelock, kept his head bowed during her 1-hour testimony. Their eyes never met. The man in charge of the raid, Superintendent Ian Beckett, said Inspector Lovelock had never considered the possibility of women and children being inside the house. After the shooting, Inspector Lovelock was gripping a windowsill and staring into the garden. He was obviously very deeply shocked, said the superintendent. Both men had been concerned about the lack of information gathered before the raid, but because of the high tension in the area, observation hadn't been possible. Even plainclothes men would have stood out there, said Mr. Beckett. He was asked if there'd been the possibility of getting the house plans from Lambeth Council. He replied, in theory, yes, in practice, no. It's sometimes dangerous because in the past, details of police operations have been leaked from various departments. The case continues tomorrow. Simon Cole, News at 10, the Old Bailey.
An emergency meeting of the directors of the Guinness Brewing Group to discuss allegations of illegal share dealing has broken up tonight without any statement being issued. The company says it did not authorize its merchant bank to use Guinness money to buy over 2 million of its own shares. Earlier, Guinness said it would sue the Ansbacher Merchant Bank if it did not repay £7.6 million, the money that the bank says was used to buy the Guinness shares. Guinness shares closed unchanged today at 295p.
Inside its headquarters tonight, the embattled Guinness board was agonising over how to repair the damage done by weeks of mudslinging. Since the Department of Trade inquiry into the Guinness takeover of the Distillers Group, Guinness Chief Executive, Ernest Saunders, has been under intense pressure to relinquish some of his power. He denies any wrongdoing, but Guinness has been accused of illegal dealing in its own shares. All parties agree that last May Guinness deposited £7.6 million in an account with the merchant bank Henry Ansbacher. Guinness received no interest on that money and now want it back. Ansbacher says it was told to use the money to buy shares in Guinness by their bankers Morgan Grenfell, something Morgan Grenfell denies. Buying the shares would have kept the price up, but it's illegal for a company to buy its own shares without shareholders' prior approval. So is it usual for a company to deposit such a large sum of money interest-free?
No, it certainly is not typical. Indeed, in my experience, I would say that it is unique. I've never encountered anything like it.
But are there any suggestions, as far as you can see, of illegality?
If a company were to be proved guilty of buying its own shares without shareholders' approval, that would be an illegal action under the Act and would be punishable by a fine or possibly imprisonment. I'm not asserting that there are suggestions of illegality. I don't know.
There remain some key questions for the inspectors to answer. Did Guinness agree to the purchase of their own shares? Did Morgan Grenfell, Guinness's banker, arrange the deal? Or did Ansbacher act by itself? Ansbacher's equally insistent that it's done nothing wrong, but the Department of Trade is still interviewing the main figures in the Guinness affair, and the City expects further revelations. Mark Webster, News at 10, The City.
Mrs Thatcher all but ruled out a spring election today, one before June anyway, saying the country didn't expect to dash to the polls at the first opportunity. She said she was aghast at the idea of a hung parliament and power sharing with the Alliance, though it may be that it has to be done. Labour have ruled out a coalition. The Prime Minister, speaking on BBC Radio London, said she would rather there wasn't speculation about the election date because it made things difficult for businesses.
We'll make up our mind when the time comes, and we don't know quite when that'll be. And I just have a great belief that people in this country don't expect us to dash into elections at the first opportunity.